A small-town mechanic follows her dog into an abandoned scrapyard and uncovers a sealed safe, human bones, and a 20-year-old secret that shatters everything she thought she knew about her family. Watch until the end to see the truth that refused to stay buried. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves real mysteries. On Sundays, the salvage yard spoke in its own weather. Wind threaded through hollow doors and ribbed hoods, made a low organ note in the mouths of mufflers, rattled a paper tag that no longer belonged to anything. Fog hung low over southern Oregon, the kind that softens edges and turns distance into rumor. Ruby Mercer zipped her flannel up to her chin and let Duke, her old Labrador, choose the path. His paws found the thin ribbon of gravel between stacked sedans. His nose worked the cold air like he was reading a letter that had taken 20 years to arrive. Mercer Auto Salvage looked small from the road, just a scatter of roofs and a fence line sagging in the middle like a tired breath. But inside it unfolded into a rusted labyrinth. Her father used to call it a library of mistakes, each car a volume you could open to find out how somebody's worst day went. Since he died, Ruby kept the doors open by force of habit and stubbornness. She could rebuild the carburetor by feel, tell you which buyer would lowball and which would try to pass off flood damage as a little moisture, sign her name on invoices with a hand that didn't shake. What she could not do on most days was walk the back acres without thinking about the rooms in herself, where a door had slammed shut on September 14, 1999. Today, the fog made the yard feel new. Today, the yard felt like it wanted something. Duke paused, one paw lifted, head tilted left. Ruby followed his attention to a wall of blackberry vines that had muscled their way up a ramp of crushed chassis, a green curtain where, as far as she knew, there was nothing. She had passed this dead end 100 times. The vines glittered with dew. Barbs as fine as eyelashes waited for any excuse to catch skin. "You're kidding," she told the dog. He was not kidding. He nosed the vines, tested the give, and slipped along the seam where brambles gave way to a slit of darkness. Ruby hesitated just long enough to know she should turn back. Then she pushed in after him, ducking beneath the jagged jaw of a torn mirror, shoulders grazing cold steel, blackberry canes whispering on her sleeves like impatient hands. The corridor beyond was narrow and dim, framed by towers of cars pressed so close together the fog could not find a way between them. Sound receded. Even the highway hum thinned to a rumor. The air smelled of wet iron and something older, a dust that had learned how to keep secrets. The corridor bent left, then left again, as if it had been shaped by the memory of a path rather than a hand that meant to make one. It opened into a clearing, the kind that only neglect can build. A long, rotted carport leaned on 3 good posts and one that wasn't trying anymore. The roof was a quilt of moss stitched down by ivy. Inside, shadows pooled like water. A Lincoln Continental slept under a sheen of grime, its grill a broken grin. A 60s pickup had buckled into itself, doors fused shut by time and weather. At the back, half swallowed by the dark and pinned beneath what had once been a tarp, sat a square shape that did not belong to the yard's logic of useful ruin. A safe. Ruby felt the change in her body before she had a thought about it. A small tightening under the sternum, the way the eyes decide to go still when a deer steps out at the edge of a field. She stepped closer. The paint had been a deep green once. Now it had the sick color of a bruise fading. The edges were reinforced. The seam around the door was clean, purposeful, a promise that whatever was inside mattered to the person who'd shut it away. Above the dial, Letters ghosted out of the oxidized surface. Kessler Security, model 1979. She crouched. Cold climbed through the steel and into her knees. When she brushed the dial, grit whispered under her thumbnail. The smell rising from the seam was paper dry and sour with old ink. No one had ever mentioned a safe. Not in the stories her father told after dinner when the TV played to itself and he thumbed a beer label to ribbons. Not in the inventory sheets or the pencil maps tacked to his office wall. Not in the bitter, quiet years after Grace disappeared and her mother learned how to talk around the emptiness without ever stepping inside it. Duke's shoulder warmed her leg. He looked at the safe, then at Ruby, then away. A dog's version of a shrug that meant, "We can leave if you say the word." She didn't say the word. The dial turned a quarter inch with a dry, stubborn chew. She stopped and listened. The yard had 1,000 small noises, but none of them lived in this metal. The mechanism held its breath. The keyhole below the dial was small, oval, rimmed in grime, easy to miss in the dim. Ruby ran her fingertip along the lip and felt the resistance of dirt caked hard by time. "Okay," she whispered, not sure whether she spoke to the safe or to herself. Something gleamed in the leaf mold at the Lincoln's bumper, a precise, impatient glint of brass. She brushed aside a mat of wet pine needles and found a key. The metal was cold enough to surprise. Its teeth were worn, but sharp enough to tell you they had done their job more than once. A leather tag, stiff with age, hung from the ring. The fog had blessed it with a slick shine. Ink had bled and thinned across the leather until the numbers were almost gone. Almost. September 14th, 1999. The date hit her like a hand to the chest. Ruby did not have to translate it. She did not have to place it. It was already inside her, etched in a layer deeper than memory. She was 7 again, standing on the porch, while police radios murmured like angry bees, and her mother's mouth moved without making sound, and her father paced with his hands on his hips, and then with his hands on his head, and then with his hands clenched around a story he could not figure out how to tell. She brought the tag closer to her face. The digits leaned forward in a right-hand slant that she had watched 1,000 times at the kitchen table, attached to the arm that reached for the salt, the arm that flicked the TV off when the news got bad. Her father's handwriting. The air narrowed. She put the key in her pocket to keep from dropping it. The keyhole welcomed the metal halfway, as if remembering the shape, then stalled. She rotated the key gently, feeling for the notch a locksmith once designed for a problem like this, and found it. The key slid in the rest of the way with a small, tired click. The dial loosened under her palm, a breath she didn't know she was waiting for. She turned the handle. The safe opened with the grudging grace of a jaw that had learned to clench. Inside, layers of paper things gone brittle, folders tied with twine, a curl of photo corners, the static silence of secrets kept too long. Ruby lifted the top file. It had the specific weight of significance. Not heavy the way a part is heavy, but heavy the way a word is when you finally say it out loud. On the first page, a photograph. Black and white, the yard in the background clean-boned and young, a girl in front, chin up, hair pinned back with an impatience that looked familiar because Ruby had seen it every time she had confronted a frozen bolt, or a buyer who thought "little lady" was a clever way to begin a sentence. The girl's eyes did not plead. They held Grace. Her own breath startled her. It came out like she hadn't been meaning to let it go. Beneath the photo, a form. Employee intake, Mercer Auto Salvage. Name, Grace Ann Mercer. Start date, August 17th, 1999. Supervisor, Douglas Mercer. The ink was blue, the letters crisp. Her father's name sat on the page like a stone in a boot. For years he had told a story that made a kind of sense if you needed it too. Grace wanted out. Grace needed space. Grace had friends who were no good. Grace left. Now the page in Ruby's hand said something simpler and meaner. Grace was here. He was too. And he had never said. Ruby flipped forward. Receipts, sales logs, inventory sheets. Numbers that wouldn't line up if you begged them. Cars purchased in lots that didn't appear anywhere else. Cash deliveries, initials in the margins like breadcrumb anchors. R.M., Ray Mallory, who had sat at their kitchen table and laughed too loud and disappeared from their lives right after Grace did. A page with one line boxed in red pen, the kind of emphasis you use when you're terrified someone won't listen. Car lot 43, do not open. She knew lot 43. Knew it the way you know the shape of a room you're never allowed to enter. It was the basin at the back where crushed sedans leaned into one another like drunks in a fight, where the ground sank a fraction and held on to fog longer than the rest of the yard. When she was 10, she'd tried to climb there, a race with herself to the top of the heap. Her father had reached her before the second car, his hand around her wrist, his voice a stranger's voice in his throat. Not back there. Ever. She found a smaller envelope near the bottom of the stack. Brown, thin, sealed with tape that had gone yellow and brittle at the edges. For Ruby, it said in that familiar tilt. The letters had a hurry in them, as if the hand that wrote them had to do it standing up, with other hands hovering nearby. She wanted not to open it. She opened it. If you find this, I'm sorry. The first line bent her forward like a push between the shoulder blades. Duke pressed against her shin again, an anchor in dog form. I thought burying it would mean it stayed gone. I thought I could hold on to you and let go of the rest. Grace was working with me when she found something I couldn't let her keep. I told myself I was protecting her. I was protecting myself. Lot 43 isn't a pile of cars, it's a door. If you're at this paper, you've already felt it open a crack. Don't go alone. I should have said this out loud a long time ago. I should have done a lot of things. The words blurred. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, irritated at the body for doing what it wanted. The last line was a sentence she heard in his voice, the way you hear a particular song in a crowd, and can name it from 3 notes. Some things in this yard don't want to be found. If one ever does, you'll know. She folded the letter back along its old creases and slid it into her jacket pocket with the key. The paper felt warm against her ribs, as if carrying someone else's apology could raise the temperature of your own chest. The fog tapped its fingers on the face of the yard. Something small shifted in the carport. Just weight recalculating itself, just rust letting go of something it had held too long, but the sound made her look up as if it had spoken her name. She set the folder down carefully, made a second pass through the safe to see what else was simple and impossible at once. A Polaroid of the office from another decade, calendar turned to September, a cup of pens with 3 chewed blue caps, the window without the crack it would later wear like a scar. A ledger with 2 columns of numbers that refused to be friends. A receipts envelope stamped September with a hand tally in the corner. 14. Her skin prickled the way it does when a storm means to be believed. Ruby repacked the contents almost the way she'd found them. Not out of reverence for order, but because putting things back where they had waited made the air feel less strained. She closed the safe. The seal kissed shut with a sound that felt final if you wanted it to, and not at all if you didn't. "Come on," she told Duke. Her voice was steady now. It could afford to be. The part of the day where you touch the live wire is rarely the part where you jump. They retraced the narrow corridor, the brambles tugging at her sleeves as if to keep the future from getting out. When they broke into the more honest light of the main yard, the ordinary noises came back in layers. A chainsaw 2 properties over. A gull cutting a clean line through the fog. The clunk of a sign on the fence bumping its post. Ruby walked the long way to the office so her legs could remember that walking was only walking. Inside, she shut the door, turned the deadbolt, because that's what you do to a feeling when you can't give it a name, and pulled the blinds halfway down. The smell in the office was the smell of her father's shirts. Cedar and motor oil and the faint sweetness of hand cleaner he used to pretend wasn't lotion. On the desk, the pencil maps waited under a paperweight made from a chunk of glass that looked like a fossilized wave. The pencil's eraser had been worn to a pink nub. She laid the folder on the blotter and took photos of each page with her phone. This was not a plan. This was a reflex. A mechanic who documents how a thing looked before she takes it apart, so she can believe in the possibility of reverse. Grace, she said, the name soft enough that if anyone else had been in the room, they might have thought she was reading from the form. Saying it out loud did something to the quiet. It changed it from absence to presence. Duke flopped under the desk with a tired sigh. His tail thumped once, then went still. Ruby flipped her father's maps until she found the back acres. The pencil lines made sense until they didn't. The farthest corner was drawn sparsely, as if the hand that had sketched the familiar had been careful not to invent what it refused to name. There was no Lot 43 on paper. There had never needed to be. Some places exist perfectly well without ink. The date on the leather tag pulsed behind her eyes. September 14th, 1999. She wrote it on a sticky note and set it next to the map, like you might leave a glass of water beside a bed for a visitor you weren't ready to see. She read the intake form again. She read the letter again. She read the boxed-in warning. Do not open. Her mouth had gone dry in a way that coffee would not fix. She made coffee anyway. The machine hissed like a cat. When the mug steamed in her hand, she did not drink from it. She held it because it was warm, and because rooms look less dangerous when something normal is happening in them. Through the blinds, she could see the first row of the yard, the Ford that should have gone last week, the tarp she had been meaning to pull tighter over the Civic with the sunburned paint. The world looked ordinary from this small square of glass. It often does, if you let it. She set the mug down, traced the curve of the leather tag with her thumb, and felt the 3 ridges where her father's pen had pressed a little too hard on the 9S, the way he always did with numbers that mattered. All the years of staying busy, of keeping the lights on and the doors open, of speaking about Grace in the past tense because the present felt like a lie. You could stack them like the cars out back, and it would not change the fact of a key that fit a safe, a date that fit a hole in a family, a signature that fit a man who believed that burying something was a synonym for saving it. Ruby wasn't a detective. She was a mechanic with a yard and a dog, and a promise to herself that she would not invent hope where none could live. But hope wasn't what the key had offered. The key had offered a door. It had offered the cold weight of a fact. She slid the key back into her pocket and let it rest there against the warmth of the letter. The edges bit her palm through the denim. The discomfort helped. It made the day feel less like a story she had told herself and more like something the ground had finally decided to confess. Duke's ears twitched. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was listening to the yard the way he listened to weather. Ruby followed his gaze anyway, because that's what you do when you have learned that looking away is a luxury you don't always get to keep. Outside, nothing moved. Inside, she exhaled and made herself say the thing that would set the next hour in motion. Grace didn't leave. The words sat in the room like a tool set on a table, plain, heavy, available. She wasn't yet ready to lift it and see what else it could do. That would come. For now, the chapter had opened exactly the way chapters sometimes do in real life, without permission or warning, without anybody asking whether you were in the mood to turn the page. Ruby reached for the folder again and found the strength she trusted. Not the kind that charges, but the kind that endures. She looked at the intake form, at the photo, at the boxed warning about a place that did not have a name, but had always had a shape. She put her fingers on the corner of the page and pressed, as if to test whether paper could push back. It didn't. It only waited. By the time the coffee had cooled in the mug and the fog had thinned to a fine thread, Ruby knew what tomorrow would be. Not everything, not even most things. She had learned the hard way that you only get the next step, not a map. But she knew this. The yard had whispered. She had heard. And the ground where the whisper came from was the same ground that had closed over her sister's name and tried to keep it. A key and a date had turned that ground into something else. She stood, ran a hand through Duke's fur, and let her palm rest a second longer between his ears. "We're not done," she said. The yard didn't answer. It didn't need to. It had already told her what it had to say. By late afternoon, the fog had thinned into a high gauze, the kind of light that makes metal look honest. Ruby waited it out by doing the kinds of tasks that let hands move while the mind catches up, tightening the tarp on the sunburned Civic, marking a gearbox for a buyer who wouldn't show, sweeping the grit from the office threshold into a neat, doomed pile. The key in her pocket weighed every step, a small brass gravity that kept pulling her toward the back acres. She told herself she was just going to look. The generator shed sat against the fence line like a stubborn tooth. Concrete walls, flat roof, a rusted vent that whistled when the wind came from the west. Ivy had made a second door of itself across the actual one. The chain and padlock were scabbed with brown. When Ruby brushed the leaves back, the lock felt colder than the day. The tag on the small key read "Generator" in her father's hand, each letter carved into the paper like he'd been trying to make the word stay put. The key slid into the lock with the reluctant elegance of a move practiced long ago. The cylinder resisted. She wiggled. It turned. The chain slumped with the heavy, guilty clink of a secret deciding to retire. "Stay," she told Duke. He didn't. He nosed in first, tail low, a professional pessimist. The inside smelled like a thrift store underwater. Wet cardboard, dust that had traded hands too many times, a metallic ghost of old electricity. A single pull-string light hung in the center. She tugged. The bulb coughed itself awake and held. The generator itself sat hulking along the back wall, covered with a sun-faded tarp. It hadn't turned over in years, but that didn't make the room dead. 2 shelves lined the far wall, sagging with boxes that wore the anonymities of a conspiracy's clerical phase. Parts, private, confidential, misc. The handwriting on the labels didn't match her father's. It was too careful, like someone had practiced in front of a mirror to look tidy. One box on the bottom shelf had been opened and not properly closed. Tape lifted at the corners like a scab you itch at. Ruby looked at it and felt the now familiar slide of her gut into a colder gear. She knelt, pulled back the flaps. Videotapes, dozens, black spines with white paper labels. Some had dates in blue pen, tidy and bleak: July 3rd, 99, August 31st, 99, September 12th, 99. Some had initials. Some had only numbers that meant nothing to her yet. Near the front of the box sat one cassette with a handwriting she knew from birthday cards and notes on the fridge. A slightly left-leaning Grace. The portable TV VCR unit that lived on a cart in the office had been a joke for years, used for old training tapes and once, in the kind of loneliness that finds you on Tuesdays, to rewatch a thrifted copy of Twister. Ruby had hauled it out earlier and left it by the door because she'd already decided the kind of person she was going to be today. She plugged it into the outlet near the floor. The outlet worked. The TV woke with a hum like a big insect behind glass. When she fed the tape, the machine accepted it with a swallow. Static filled the screen. Not white, not black, a living pattern that made the eyes want to blink it away. The sound wasn't silent. Static never is. It's a room full of people only saying, Then the picture hiccuped, stabilized, focused enough to give faces back their edges. Grace sat in the smaller outbuilding office, the satellite shed they used when inventory ran too hot for the main building. The calendar behind her said September. The days square had been scratched out with a ballpoint pen until the paper had almost given up. The window on her left looked toward the back acres. It was dark beyond it, the kind of dark that begins before it's earned the right to be called night. Ruby couldn't make herself breathe for the first 10 seconds. She counted them anyway. Her father had taught her to count when fear climbed the ladder of her spine. 10 down to 1, then again. "If you're watching this," Grace said, and the sound of her voice hit Ruby with a physical force. A tuning fork struck against bone. "Hi, Rue." She was 19 and looked older in the way people do when they're tired of being argued with. Her hair was pinned back. She wore the blue Mercer Salvage work shirt with the stitched patch. Grace. Her hands were on the table, fingers knitted so tightly the knuckles were white. "I thought I could talk to him," she said. "I keep thinking if I try a different door, he'll open it. But we're in it now. He is. Maybe he always was. Maybe that's not fair. I don't know. I'm not recording this to punish anybody. I'm recording it because if it goes wrong, someone has to pick up the rope and pull." She stood, the camera image tipping a little because she'd propped the lens on a stack of binders. She reached out of frame and came back with a photo. The camera didn't love the detail. The gloss caught the light and flashed. But Ruby could see a flatbed truck and the suggestion of stacked, crushed cars. 6 figures stood in front of it. Someone had taken a marker to one face and scrubbed it out to a dark oval. The ink pressed so hard the paper had puckered. "That's the one," Grace said, tapping the blacked-out face. "R, he's the one who has the fence key and the cash. He doesn't care about cars. He cares about what the ground will do if you ask it with enough money." She set the photo down, leaned in. "Lot 43 isn't a lot. It's a lid. There's a room under the room where they keep the bad numbers. I can't show you tonight. The chain is new, and the padlock isn't one of Dad's. R brought a guy who knows how to weld, and they did something to the hinge under the concrete lip. But I found a way. I just need to wait until nobody's watching." Grace glanced past the lens, toward the window, toward darkness. "The thing is, there's always somebody watching." The tape jittered, rolled, steadied. The TV threw a line of static like a white scar across the picture and then ate it again. When Grace spoke next, her voice had the soft tone she used with Ruby when Ruby had been 7 and afraid of night windows. "If you're here, Rue, I didn't make it out the other side. That's not fair to say. I hate it when people make their fear your job. But you're the person I'd trust to turn a wrench the right way the first time. You don't lie to machines. You don't lie to people. Don't let them pack this place full of forgetfulness and call it mercy." She smiled, quick and unwilling, like a person who knows the joke is bad but can't help enjoying it anyway. "And don't climb the cars," she added. "You always think you're taller than you are." She reached forward, and her face filled the screen for a fraction of a second, eyes clear and fierce, mouth set. "Lot 43, Rue. It's not a pile. It's a vault." The picture went to fuzz and stayed there, the sound of a sky without stations. Ruby realized she had been sitting on her heel too long, only when it went numb and then burned. She put her palms to the concrete and waited for the feeling to come back like a punished thing. Duke stood with his chin on the edge of the TV cart, head cocked. He didn't whine. He didn't wag. He was the kind of dog who understood that the room had changed and would let it change. "Hi, Gracie," Ruby said to Static, and it surprised her that the words came out without cracking. "I found the safe." She rewound the last 30 seconds and watched her sister lean toward her again, eyes wide like a door thrown open to the afternoon. Then she ejected the tape, labeled it with a piece of masking tape and the word "copy," and fed it back in to make a clone. The copier in the office would give her paper. This would give her time. While the machine spun, she opened the other boxes. Most held receipts and envelopes sealed with supplier names that meant nothing. One had Polaroids of license plates on cars that had never officially come through the yard. Another held a pocket recorder with 2 microcassettes. She wanted to sit right there and put the tapes to her ear like seashells. Instead, she put them in her backpack because some curiosities deserve an audience of more than one. The light bulb made a small zapping sound and flickered. She looked up and realized the sun had dipped further than she intended to let it. Evening in the yard was a different math. Shadows made allies of things that didn't deserve them. "Okay," she told Duke. "We go, we lock, we breathe." They left the shed the way they'd come. Ruby rewrapped the chain and pressed the lock's shackle down until the click sat in her teeth. She hated the relief that followed. It was the kind of relief you feel when you slide a dresser in front of a door, satisfying and insufficient. The path from the shed to the office runs straight until it doesn't, then jogs around a pile of hoods waiting on a buyer who likes his inventory to look like broken armor. Ruby felt watched before she saw anything. She'd always thought that was a cliché people used when they wanted to put a string section under a sentence. But there it was, skin crawling in a very specific direction, like her body had a compass and the needle had just quivered north. She slowed without letting her feet look like they were slowing. Duke's head came up, ears forward, nostrils working. He made no sound, and the absence of sound felt more serious than any bark. The fence line to her right runs along a belt of sugar pines. Deadfall gathers there in natural, untidy stacks, a version of the yard makes for itself. Someone was standing among the trunks. She didn't see a person. She saw the changes a person makes, how silence shifts around a body, how birds reorganize their conversations, how the space between 2 trees feels occupied without being able to tell you why. Ruby kept walking. She did not look. Looking tells. She passed a row of stacked Subarus and came even with the old Bronco, whose tailgate had never closed right. The Bronco had a side mirror whose glass had fallen out years ago. The mirror housing reflects at the angle of a bad habit. From it, she could have a sideways glance down the fence without pivoting her head. A shape leaned out from behind a trunk and then back. Tall, thin. The movement had the economy of habit. A gloved hand tested the fence, just 2 fingers pressing the chain link to feel the give. The fence made a faint metallic plaintive. I am what I am. I'm old. I still hold. Ruby's mouth went dry. Fear has a taste if you let it get to your tongue. She thought of her father's letter, of the sentence that had felt like a dare. Some things still breathe. She thought of the taped face in the photo and the ink pressed so hard the paper puckered. She didn't break stride. She reached into her jacket and touched the wrench. Cold metal greeted cold hand. She told her legs to be legs. She told her eyes to be mirrors. The shape by the fence didn't come closer. It didn't go away. It remained exactly the way a problem remains when it is deciding what kind of problem to be. Back in the office, she set her backpack on the desk and locked the door, then locked it again, because the hand likes to do something when the mind can't. She went to the window and lifted the blind with 2 fingers, leaving the slat line just enough to see the front steps and the gravel. Nothing moved. The yard pretended innocence with the skill of a liar who has become his lie. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Unknown number. She answered because the body sometimes wants to be brave to prove to the mind that it can be. Static. Not the kind on the tape, thick with signal. This was thin, like wind hissing through reed grass. Then a man's voice, almost friendly. Evening, Mercer. Her name sounded wrong from a stranger's mouth. It was too clean. Her tongue remembered the other versions. Rubes, Rue, Mercer. The one her father used when he wanted help lifting something heavy. Ruby girl, come here. This voice had no edges to catch a finger on. Wrong number, she said, and kept her voice flat. Fear freezes. Flat is better. Funny, that's what you'll tell them, he said, as if continuing a conversation she hadn't known they were having. Wrong number, wrong lot, wrong door. You should go home. The call clicked dead. The room felt too small. Duke, who believed in doors and people and bowls and beds, made a sound she had never heard from him, a low, ascending note that meant this is larger than me. Ruby took exactly 1 minute to do dumb things on purpose. Check the back door when she knew it was locked. Replug the TV even though it hadn't moved. Flip through the photos she'd taken of the documents like they might have added new words while she was outside. Then she forced the minute to end. She printed a copy of her father's letter. She printed the intake form. She printed the boxed warning. She wrote Lot 43 on a sticky note, because writing a name is a way of making a thing visible to yourself. She tore the sticky note in half and wrote Jason on one piece. The journalist owed her nothing. He had been fair to her in a story about catalytic converter thefts last winter. That was all. It would have to be enough. The copied tape spit itself finished. She labeled the clone Grace, copy, and slid the original into a Ziploc bag, then both into the backpack. She added the pocket recorder and the microcassettes. She took the brass safe key and the generator key and put them in the small inner pocket she used for cash and folded receipts when she went to auctions. The light outside the office door flicked once, just once, the way a motion sensor gives itself a pat-down. Ruby froze. Some motion lights live their own lives, swatting insects with illumination. This one woke only when something larger passed. She stood in the doorway between office and shop and stared at the frosted glass panel of the outer door, watching for the shadow of a shape to move across it. Nothing moved. The light went out again as if shaking its head. Ruby thumbed a text to Jason instead of calling. If you're up, I have something. It's Grace. She didn't add a question mark because she wasn't asking. The phone pinged 2 minutes later. I'm on the desk at the paper. You okay? The words had the care of a person who tries not to scare what they're trying to help. "No," she typed and laughed once, a short surprised sound at the honesty. "But I've got proof. Come in the morning. First light. Come alone. Copy. Sunrise." She put the phone face down, locked the office for the third time, and clicked off the lights. The yard moved into its night face. Less a place than a presence, the way a dark room has a personality if you spent your childhood in a house that creaked. Duke settled at the door with his nose along the crack at the bottom, a sentry assigned by love. Ruby lay on the office couch because the house felt too far and too fragile, because putting ground she owned between herself and the person at the fence made a kind of sense her body could accept. She didn't sleep. Sleep requires surrender. She let her eyes close and counted her sister's breaths from the tape, the inhale before she said, "Hi, Rue," the exhale that had carried the word vault into a room 20 years later. Somewhere after midnight, a chain moved. Not much, just enough. She sat up and the couch springs protested like a cat. Duke was already standing, head high, not barking. She held his collar, both to steady him and to steady herself. The chain moved again, a faint metallic conversation that ended before it could begin. The motion light did not come on this time. Whoever was out there knew the yard better than most, or knew enough to be learning. Ruby didn't go to the window. She didn't turn on lights. She waited. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is fail to announce yourself. When the sound didn't return, when the dogs in the houses down the road decided no one else needed to be told about whatever had just tested the fence. When her heart stopped pounding in the top of her throat and moved back down where hearts are supposed to live, Ruby exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been hoarding. Morning felt like a deal struck badly. The sky went from slate to milk. The yard showed her its dents again. She stood, stretched the kind of stretch that shakes tired out of joints, but not out of the mind, and opened the office door to a world that looked exactly the same and was not. On the front steps, the gravel held 2 new prints. Same boots as before. Same measured distance between strides. A cigarette butt sat beside the bottom step, filtered end mashed into gray. She picked it up in a napkin because you never know what a small thing will decide to be, sealed it in a Ziploc, and labeled it because naming is the opposite of erasing. When she turned, the yard gave her back her reflection in a patch of window glass. A woman in a flannel, jaw set, hair tied back with a blue elastic that had seen better days. Behind the glass, her sister's name on a tape. In her pocket, 2 keys that fit 2 doors. In the fence, a new idea, that the yard had ceased to be only a place where the past slept and had become a place where the present had taken an interest. "Lot 43, Ruby said to the morning, as if it were a person who might show its face if properly greeted. "I hear you," Duke sneezed, which in his language meant finally. Behind the pines, a truck downshifted on the road and kept going. In the window, Ruby's mouth made a line that was not a smile and not a grimace. If a camera had been pointed her way, it would have caught something else entirely. Resolve announcing itself not with a speech, but with the ordinary act of a person putting on her jacket. She should have been afraid. She was. She should have been careful. She would be. She should have called the sheriff now, this minute, and handed over the tape and the keys and the letter and asked the law to carry a load it had refused to lift 20 years ago. She texted Jason instead. "Sunrise is here." Then she picked up the backpack, set the wrench in the side pocket, and moved toward the back acres, toward a door that wasn't a door yet, and a vault that had been pretending all this time to be a heap of cars. The yard didn't speak. It had run out of hints. It was done whispering. It was ready to be opened. The morning light over Mercer Auto Salvage looked almost gentle, as if the world hadn't changed overnight. Dew clung to the rusted curves of old bumpers. Fog moved like a soft tide between stacks of forgotten cars, and the wind carried the faint hum of the distant highway. But to Ruby Mercer, nothing about the yard was ordinary anymore. Not after the safe, not after the tape, not after the phone call from a stranger who knew her name. She had slept in fits, every small noise jerking her awake. The shifting groan of metal, Duke's restless pacing, the phantom click of a lock turning somewhere it shouldn't. By dawn, Ruby gave up on pretending she could rest. She packed her bag deliberately. Gloves, flashlight, extra batteries, her phone, a wrench heavy enough to be a weapon if it came to that. And, most importantly, the 2 keys. One for the safe, one for the generator. They were more than keys now. They were promises. "Ready?" she asked Duke. He stretched and yawned, then trotted toward the back gate without hesitation. Ruby followed. Lot 43 didn't have a sign or a boundary marker. It was simply there, an unspoken region of the salvage yard that no one, not even Ruby's father, ever acknowledged. As she walked deeper into the maze of rusting metal, the world seemed to tighten around her. The cars were different here, piled at odd angles, crushed into unnatural shapes. Some looked like they had been stacked deliberately, as if trying to conceal something beneath them. The air grew colder, heavier. Even Duke slowed, his tail rigid, his steps careful. "This is it," Ruby whispered. The heart of Lot 43 was a basin, a shallow depression in the earth where fog gathered like a living thing. At its center sat a small shack, nothing more than a few walls of warped aluminum siding and a sagging roof. A red X had been spray-painted on the door long ago, now faded to a ghostly pink. Chains wrapped around the handle, a thick padlock sealing it shut. Ruby's pulse thrummed in her throat. She reached for the brass key from her pocket. It slid into the padlock with unnerving ease, too easily for something that hadn't been opened in decades. Someone had been here recently. The lock clicked open. The chain slithered to the ground. "Stay close," Ruby told Duke, her voice lower than she intended. He pressed against her leg, eyes fixed on the door. It swung open with a long, aching creak, releasing a breath of air that smelled like mildew, dust, and something far older, something that had waited too long in the dark. A single bare bulb dangled from the ceiling. Ruby flipped the switch. It flickered weakly, then held. The shack was empty, or at least it appeared to be. Just a concrete floor, a few collapsed shelves, and cobwebs so thick they looked like gauze curtains. Then Ruby saw it. A metal hatch bolted into the ground. Her heartbeat stumbled. "A door beneath a door," she murmured, just like she said. Grace's words from the videotape echoed in her mind. "Lot 43 isn't a pile. It's a vault." Ruby knelt beside the hatch. The bolts were old, but not impossible. She slipped on her gloves and began to work. Each one screamed in protest as it loosened, the sound ricocheting around the small shack like a warning. Duke's growl rumbled softly behind her. The final bolt gave way. Ruby hesitated, her hand hovering over the cold steel handle. Then she pulled. A rush of stale air erupted from below, damp, heavy, metallic. A narrow staircase disappeared into blackness. "This is it," she whispered and started down. The stairs creaked beneath her boots, the wood softened by age and moisture. The deeper she descended, the colder the air became, wrapping around her like a damp shroud. At the bottom, her flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing a low-ceilinged room carved from concrete and lined with rust-streaked walls. Ruby's breath hitched. Along the far wall, rows of metal filing cabinets stood like soldiers, their drawers labeled with codes and dates. Wooden crates were stacked beside them, covered with tarps stiff from time. And on the wall opposite the stairs hung a massive bulletin board, so crowded with photographs, notes, and newspaper clippings that it looked like the inside of someone's fevered mind. Ruby stepped closer. Her light fell on a photo of Grace, younger, smiling, arm slung over Ruby's shoulder. Next to it, another photo, this time of her father, standing beside a man Ruby recognized as Ray Mallory. Below them, dozens of unfamiliar faces, men in suits, women in lab coats, people posed in front of trucks loaded with crushed cars. Every single one of their faces was circled in red ink. At the bottom of the board, a single phrase scrawled in trembling handwriting: "We buried more than cars." Ruby swallowed hard. Her hands shook as she pulled the tarp from the nearest crate. Inside, neatly arranged and carefully labeled, were human bones. Dozens of them, skulls, femurs, ribs, each sealed in a clear evidence bag. Ruby stumbled back, one hand clamped over her mouth. "This isn't a salvage yard," she whispered. "It's a graveyard." The flashlight beam wavered as she turned to the filing cabinets. The first drawer groaned open, revealing stacks of documents: test reports, autopsy files, shipping manifests. Names jumped out at her, names she recognized from missing persons flyers she'd seen as a child. And there, twice, was Grace's name, once as a subject, once as a witness. Ruby's vision blurred. Grace had found this. Grace had known. Her sister hadn't vanished. She'd been erased. A thud echoed somewhere above her. Ruby froze. Duke's growl deepened, reverberating in the small concrete space. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. Silence. Then another sound, a metallic scrape, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across the floor above them. Someone was here. Someone who didn't want her to find this. Ruby killed the flashlight. The darkness swallowed her whole. She crouched low, pressing a hand to Duke's back to keep him still. Her breath sounded deafening. Seconds stretched. The noise above shifted, then faded. Minutes passed before Ruby dared move again. She turned the light back on and pulled open another cabinet drawer. Inside was a folder thicker than the rest. At the bottom of the stack, tucked between medical reports and sales ledgers, was a map. A map of the salvage yard, but not the one Ruby knew. This one was marked with hidden chambers, sealed tunnels, and car lots numbered far beyond what was visible above ground. In the bottom corner, written in Grace's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words: "Don't let this place forget me." Ruby pressed the paper to her chest. "I won't," she whispered. She pulled out her phone and started taking photos of everything. The board, the crates, the documents. Every page, every piece of evidence. She didn't know who would believe her, but she knew she needed proof. When her storage filled, she called Jason. "Jason," she said when he answered, her voice barely steady, "it's Ruby. You need to come to the yard, now." "Ruby, it's 6 in the morning. There are bodies," she said, "in lot 43. A stunned silence. Then, "I'm on my way." Ruby ended the call and shoved the phone into her pocket. She took one last look around the room, at the bones, the files, the terrible truth buried beneath decades of lies. Her father had built this place to hide something monstrous. Grace had died trying to expose it. And now Ruby was going to finish what her sister started. She climbed the stairs quickly, Duke at her side. At the top, she paused, listening. The shack above was silent. Too silent. She pushed the hatch open slowly and scanned the room. Empty. But the chain on the door was gone. Someone had been here. Ruby's heart hammered as she stepped into the daylight. The fog had thickened again, wrapping the yard in a gray cocoon. Somewhere beyond the rows of twisted metal, a door slammed. Tires crunched against gravel. Whoever had been watching her was leaving, or waiting. "Come on," she whispered to Duke. They slipped back into the maze of rust and ruin. Ruby clutched the camera, the documents, the map. The world outside was about to learn what had been buried here. And somewhere out there, someone already knew she had found it. They wouldn't stop her now. Lot 43 wasn't just a place anymore. It was a reckoning. The police cars arrived before sunrise, their red and blue lights slicing through the early morning fog like a warning. Ruby watched from the porch, her coffee mug untouched and cold in her hands, as a line of marked vehicles rolled up to the entrance of Mercer Auto Salvage. It didn't feel real. For 20 years the yard had been her refuge, a graveyard of machines and memories. Now it was a crime scene. "Stay here," she told Duke softly, though the dog was already glued to her side. Her heartbeat was steady now, not calm, not resolved, just steady. She had spent all night in the small underground chamber beneath Lot 43, photographing every file, every bone, every piece of evidence until her phone ran out of storage. She had sent copies to Jason, who promised the story would break wide open by morning. But this wasn't about the headlines. It was about the truth. 2 sheriff's deputies approached the porch, their boots crunching on the gravel. One of them, a tall woman with a lined face and a gaze that had seen too much, removed her hat as she spoke. "Miss Mercer, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Dyer. We're here because of the report you filed." Ruby nodded. "Everything's back there," she said. "Lot 43, under the shack." "Are you sure about what you found?" the other deputy asked carefully. "These are serious accusations." Ruby's eyes hardened. "I'm sure, and I have proof." They didn't question her again. By 6:30 a.m., the salvage yard was unrecognizable. Crime scene tape fluttered in the damp wind. Floodlights illuminated the rusted rows. Teams in white forensic suits moved methodically between the cars, carefully unearthing evidence that had slept beneath the soil for decades. The ground that once held silence now echoed with shouts, orders, the hiss of machinery, and the metallic groan of car frames being lifted aside. Jason arrived just as the coroner's van did, his press badge swinging from his neck and a camera bag slung over one shoulder. He looked pale, breathless, the way someone does when they know they're standing on the edge of a story that could change everything. "Ruby," he called as he jogged toward her. "I've never seen anything like this." "You and me both," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "They've already found more than I expected." Jason glanced past her towards the floodlights and the huddled investigators. "How many?" 15 so far." Ruby's throat tightened. "They're still digging." The number hung in the air like smoke. 15. 15 people who had vanished without answers, whose families had grown old waiting for a phone call that would never come. 15 lives buried in the same ground where Ruby had spent her childhood. "Do they know who they are?" Jason asked. "Some," Ruby said. "I recognized a few names from the files. Others, I don't know, but they'll all have names soon. They deserved that much." A cry from one of the investigators interrupted them. Ruby turned just in time to see a black evidence bag being lifted from a newly uncovered section of the pit. Even from a distance, she knew that bag. The stitching on the corner, GM, was unmistakable. Her legs buckled. Jason caught her before she hit the ground. "Ruby," he whispered, his voice a mixture of shock and sorrow. "Is that—" "It's her," Ruby choked out. "It's Grace." The world blurred. The yard, the people, the noise. It all faded until all she could see was that small, dark bag being carried toward the coroner's van. It felt like she was 7 years old again, standing on the porch waiting for a sister who never came home. But this time, there would be no more waiting. This time, Grace was finally coming home. The story exploded before noon. By the time the first human remains were officially identified, every local news station had a camera crew outside the salvage yard gates. Reporters shouted questions as Ruby walked past them, but she said nothing. Her attorney, one of the few people she trusted, had advised her to stay silent until the investigation was complete. But silence was heavy, and it was familiar. Too familiar. Jason, however, was not silent. His story broke online within hours. A graveyard of steel, Oregon mechanic uncovers mass grave in family salvage yard. It spread like wildfire. National networks picked it up by sunset. By nightfall, Ruby Mercer was no longer just a mechanic. She was a woman who cracked open a 20-year-old mystery, and not everyone was happy about it. By the second day, anonymous phone calls started coming in. Threats, warnings, people saying she should have left well enough alone. One message, left in a distorted voice, chilled her more than any other. "Some things are buried for a reason. Stop digging, Ruby." She saved every voicemail and handed them to the police, but deep down, she knew exactly what they meant. Grace had said it too on the tape. They're watching. On the third day, the first arrest was made. Raymond Mallory, her father's old friend, the man whose name appeared in nearly every folder Ruby had pulled from the safe, was led out of his home in handcuffs. 2 former city officials followed. Then a man from the state environmental office. All of them had ties to a land deal from 1999, a project meant to reroute a highway and redevelop industrial land for profit. When activists tried to expose the project's environmental violations and human cost, they vanished. Their bodies, it turned out, had been buried under rust and wreckage. Ruby's father had known. Maybe he hadn't killed anyone himself. Maybe he had tried to protect her, but he had been part of it, a silent accomplice to something monstrous. That night, she sat on the back steps of the house, Duke curled at her feet. The air smelled like wet pine and diesel fuel. The sky was low and heavy, promising rain. Jason sat beside her. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. Ruby stared out at the floodlights still illuminating Lot 43. "I'm not doing it for me." "Then who?" "For her." She swallowed hard. "For Grace. For every person whose name ended up in one of those files. For everyone who never got to come home." Jason nodded. "And for him?" Ruby hesitated. "I thought I hated him, for lying, for protecting the people who destroyed our family. But now, I think he was scared. Maybe more scared than I've ever been." Jason looked at her, his expression soft. "Fear makes monsters out of good people." "Yeah," she whispered, "and silence buries them." By the end of the week, Mercer Auto Salvage was unrecognizable again. Rows of evidence tents stretched across the property. Forensic teams and respirators sifted through soil samples. Federal agents took over the investigation. Old files once buried in the ground now sat in sealed boxes marked Exhibit A. And still, new bodies surfaced. Each discovery tore Ruby apart a little more. Each time a new set of remains was bagged and tagged, she thought of Grace. How her sister must have felt when she uncovered the truth and realized no one was coming to help her. But with every new name identified, with every grieving family who finally had answers, Ruby's resolve hardened. This was why she had opened the safe. This was why she had followed the trail Grace left behind. Not for vengeance, not even for justice, but for memory, for the people who had been erased, and for the promise she had whispered the night she pressed her forehead against Grace's photo. I'll find you, whatever it takes. On the 7th day, Ruby returned to Lot 43 alone. The investigators had paused their work until a specialized recovery team could arrive, so the yard was quiet again. But it was not the silence she had known all her life. It was different now, deeper, heavier, almost reverent. She walked to the edge of the pit and stared down into the hollow where the shack once stood. It looked smaller now, less like a place of fear and more like a wound finally being cleaned. Duke sat beside her, pressing against her leg. Ruby knelt and scratched behind his ears. "We're almost there, boy," she whispered. Almost. And though the night was cold and the darkness thick, for the first time since she opened that safe, Ruby Mercer felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Because the reckoning had begun, and it wasn't going to stop until every secret buried beneath Lot 43 saw the light. The day the memorial was unveiled, the sky over southern Oregon was a brilliant, endless blue, the kind of sky that felt almost cruel in its beauty. It was hard to believe that beneath the patch of grass now lined with flowers and polished stone, there had once been horror, death, silence, secrets so dark they had poisoned generations. But today, for the first time in more than 2 decades, the Mercer salvage yard was not a graveyard of shame. It was a place of remembrance. Ruby stood at the edge of Lot 43, though it wasn't called that anymore. A black granite monument rose from the earth where the shack had once been, engraved with 15 names. Some of them Ruby knew: Grace Mercer, Daniel Porter, Eliza Monroe. Others were strangers, their lives unknown to her except for the fragments she had read in the case files. But each name was carved deep into the stone, permanent and undeniable. The forgotten were forgotten no longer. A crowd had gathered, families clutching photographs, journalists adjusting camera tripods, investigators and detectives who had spent months combing through every inch of the property, activists who had marched 20 years ago and been ignored. Even a few city officials, their faces heavy with guilt, stood quietly at the back. Ruby's hands trembled slightly as she held the folded paper in her pocket. Her speech. Jason had insisted she write something down, though she hadn't decided whether she'd actually read it. She didn't feel like a speaker. She wasn't a politician or a hero. She was just a woman who had followed her dog into the wrong corner of the yard and uncovered the ugliest truth her town had ever buried. "Ready?" Jason asked softly, appearing at her side. Ruby exhaled. "No, but I don't think I ever will be." Jason smiled. "That's how you know you're ready." When her name was called, Ruby walked slowly to the podium set up near the memorial. Duke trotted beside her, his gray muzzle brushing against her leg. Conversations hushed as she approached. A few camera flashes popped in the distance, and then silence. She unfolded the paper, stared at the words she'd written, and realized she didn't need them. She spoke from somewhere deeper. "Most people think junkyards are where things go to die," she began. "Broken machines, forgotten cars, scraps of a world that doesn't work anymore. That's what I thought too, until I learned that sometimes places like this aren't graves for metal. They're graves for people." A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd. Ruby swallowed and went on. My sister, Grace, was one of them. For 20 years I believed she had left me, that she'd walked away without a word, but she didn't. She stayed, she fought, and she died trying to tell the truth. Ruby's voice trembled, but she didn't stop. This yard was built on silence, on the belief that if you bury something deep enough, people will stop looking. But silence is not peace. Silence is complicity. It's fear. And fear has no power when the truth is louder. She paused, scanning the faces in front of her. Many were crying. Some nodded in agreement. I can't bring my sister back. I can't undo the pain this place has caused, but I can make sure that none of us ever forget. And I can promise you that no matter how deeply you try to bury the truth, someone will always dig. Applause began hesitantly, then swelled until it filled the air. Ruby stepped back from the microphone, her eyes wet, her chest heavy and light all at once. Jason squeezed her shoulder as she returned to her seat. "You did it," he whispered. "No," Ruby said softly, watching the crowd gather around the monument. "We did." In the months that followed, the town of Harlow changed in ways Ruby had never thought possible. The investigation widened far beyond the salvage yard. Former officials were indicted on charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. A construction company executive was arrested for ordering the killings. 2 state employees agreed to testify in exchange for immunity, and long-buried documents revealed a web of corruption, intimidation, and cover-ups stretching back decades. Families who had once lived with questions now had answers. Some chose forgiveness. Others pursued justice. And Ruby chose memory. She transformed her father's old office into a small community archive. It wasn't much, just a few filing cabinets, a corkboard, and a coffee machine that hissed more than it brewed, but it became a place where people could come and talk about the loved ones they'd lost. Survivors of other unsolved disappearances visited. Students wrote research papers. Journalists dug into cold cases. And every Sunday, Ruby brought fresh flowers to the memorial and sat with Duke by her sister's name. Sometimes she talked. Sometimes she simply listened to the wind move through the rows of rusting cars. One afternoon, a man in his 60s came to see her. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, a worn photograph clutched in his hand. "I don't know if she's here," he said, voice shaken. "But if she is, thank you for finding her." Ruby took the photo. A young woman with a dimpled smile stared back. "She's here," Ruby said quietly, "and she's not forgotten." A year later, Ruby was invited to speak again, this time at the state capitol. Lawmakers were considering new legislation to strengthen whistleblower protections and create an independent investigative unit for missing persons cases. Ruby sat in a chamber filled with suits and microphones and spoke the same words she had said at the memorial. Silence is complicity. Fear has no power when the truth is louder. The bill passed unanimously. On a cool autumn evening, Ruby walked once more to the edge of what had once been Lot 43. The salvage yard was quieter now, not silent, but peaceful. The ghosts had been given names. The stories had been told, and for the first time in decades, the ground felt lighter beneath her feet. She sat on the grass beside the memorial and placed her palm on Grace's name. "I brought you back," she whispered. Duke lay down beside her, his breathing slow and steady. The stars began to bloom across the night sky, one by one, like tiny points of memory refusing to be forgotten. Ruby closed her eyes and listened to the wind move gently through the yard. Some stories don't end with justice. Some don't end with revenge. Some end with something deeper, a reckoning that becomes a beginning. Ruby Mercer never set out to be a hero. She was a mechanic, a sister, a woman who couldn't stop asking questions. But because she did, because she dug, 15 souls were remembered, a town was changed, and a lie was finally laid to rest. And beneath the vast, starlit Oregon sky, Ruby understood something she hadn't before. The truth had always been here. Waiting, breathing, refusing to rust. All it needed was someone brave enough to find it.